There's tons of settings in Destiny now that are on by default even though they make you play worse, and ones that are off even though they can make you play better. Things like motion blur making it harder for you to aim, the fact you can make your radar way easier to see now, and much more. I still see people missing out on these, often just because they didn't know it existed or how it worked, like controllers getting the new Deadzone settings for noticeably better aim, or computer keybinds that make things way smoother. Because of this, I've made a comprehensive list of all the ones that you should definitely be aware of. Starting with that radar one, here's a screenshot of two versions. One is nice looking and blends in with the environment, one is totally black. But there's a whole spectrum in between, and the reason is all about when an enemy is nearby. For a long time, people complained about how hard it was to see people on the radar. So much so that a lot of us switched our colorblind mode to make it yellow because that was generally easier on most maps, but it's not needed anymore. Bungie added this new setting in the gameplay section with 5 levels to choose from. Highest is dark and lowest is transparent. You'll see a lot of people running on the darkest mode, especially in Crucible, but I personally find that to be pretty distracting and highly recommend trying out medium. It's a great blend of not distracting you, but still making radar pings immediately visible. Now on that very same topic, you can also adjust the actual HUD opacity too. The default is full, which is a good thing because that's the brightest it can get, but I figured I would show you this since it's on topic and just in case you weren't aware. Another thing I've noticed with a lot of people that I help in PvP is that whenever on a larger TV, they often talk about how stuff is outside of their peripheral vision, so I thought I would clear up what the screen bound means. Setting your limits in here isn't what's going to show up on your screen, it's just the placement of your HUD information. So if you look here at my radar, it's in the far corner, right? But if I change my screen bound to be way on the inside, it doesn't just cut off my game on the TV or monitor, it simply moves the HUD in a bit. Now the last bit of info on this is just a friendly tip that you can also change the opacity of your in-game chat box. The default always distracted and annoyed me, so I changed it to lowest and never looked back. And for my PC folks, don't forget there's a keybind too to quickly hide this if you don't like how long it stays on screen before disappearing. The default is L. By the way, I recognize that this game is played in a bunch of different scenarios, like console versus computer or controller versus mouse and keyboard. I've played Destiny for thousands of hours on all setups and both inputs, so that list from the intro are the sections we're going to cover throughout the video. And although I tried to focus on things applicable to everyone, I did also include input or platform specific settings if I felt they were important enough, like how on computer you can access dim with just one button press, how the new Deadzone settings work for controllers, and then even some crossplay myths about what turning it on or off actually does. An example of a new setting that used to be platform specific is reticle location. It's now available across the board in the gameplay tab, and it's set to below center by default. Since all consoles have been locked at this lower crosshair field of view from the beginning, when Bungie introduced this option to choose, they decided to keep the below as default. I encourage people to try out centered if you play PvP because you'll find it way easier to line up headshots, but I will warn you, this setting doesn't just move your crosshair up. At first glance, it seems like that, but everything you see on your screen is built around that focal point, so when you change it, your whole field of view actually changes, and even your gun model will be adjusted too. It can feel very different and needs some getting used to, ultimately coming down to preference, but I merely wanted to let people know that this is here now. Somewhat related to this is auto look centering. Make sure you have this off because it will move your crosshair back to the central position without you ever adjusting your aim. It's intended for brand new FPS players, like my younger nephew would just run with his aimer all over the place if it weren't for this. Two more settings that are somewhat new on this page are full auto firing and full auto melee, both of which are off by default. The first one you should definitely turn on. This makes life so easy in PvE when you're dealing with tons of ads and don't want to keep pressing the shoot button. The second one, however, while I do see the appeal for meleeing a billion thralls, if you turn this on, it can mess up certain mechanics in the game. They're pretty niche, like shatter skating for example, so it's not that big of a deal for most players, but I figured I'd mention it. And last but not least on this page is just a fun reminder that you can turn off display hints. You know those info tidbits at the bottom whenever you're between activities? They're great for new and returning players, but yeah, I went years without realizing I could actually just turn them off. This next one is about the melee, and I was shocked by how many people didn't know about it or simply misunderstood it, so I felt I needed to include it, but then we're going to move on to some video settings you definitely want to change, followed by fixing some of your aim settings as we go along. in your keybinds section, regardless of controller or mouse and keyboard, the melee is split into 3 options: auto, charged, and uncharged. You likely know the difference between charged and uncharged, like one is just a punch and the other one uses up your ability, but the game's default is to have a button set to auto and then nothing on the other 2. I think they do this so that you only have to remember one button to press and then let the game decide which version of the melee to use for you. It's not too bad at deciding and mostly depends on how close the enemy is. So if they're in your face, it'll usually use the punch, and if they're far away, it'll use the charge. But that isn't always the case and can make it way worse for you. An example is a popular Solar Titan build where you just go ham one-shotting everything in sight with a hammer. This isn't feasible with the default setting, and because of that, a lot of people eventually turn auto off and then just pick 2 specific binds for both charged and uncharged. That way they can just decide which one to use when they want, but it can be hard if you have limited button real estate. And when surveying my Discord about it, I couldn't believe how many people either didn't know this or were still confused about how auto melee actually works. In that solar example, I showed that it'll prioritize a punch over the hammer, preventing you from doing that fun build, but then on Strand Titan, it'll actually burn away your melee charge when you often don't want to. Being the OCD guy that I am, I decided to test out every single scenario on pretty well every type of melee in the game and figure out what kind of combination of keybinds is best. There were well over 50 tests in game and it's way too much to show on screen, but I did make this giant summary table. I know it's a lot to look at and we're not going to comb through it right now. I just simply wanted to give you something that you can screenshot and read later in case you want to know what the auto melee actually prioritizes and what some of the pros and cons are of different button setups. Setup number 2 is best if you can manage it, but otherwise I'd go for number 4. Now, by the way, this type of extensive testing I typically share with everyone in my community Discord. So if you're interested in these types of things or like getting this kind of info, I definitely recommend you join the Discord for a great place to hang out. Moving on in the list though, let's talk about some video settings that you want to make sure of. Starting out is the motion blur that I mentioned in the intro. It's a video setting on all platforms that I implore you to turn off. It basically makes everything around you impossible to see in detail when moving. Something as simple as dodging, turning around quickly to shotgun someone, or anything of the case is making your life as hard as possible to hit the shots you need to. Even if you do manage to hit a shot, it'll often lower your headshot accuracy. Please turn this off. Some others are chromatic aberration and film grain, which I thought this article headline captured beautifully. The writer said, "I was gonna rant about film grain in games until I remembered that chromatic aberration exists, the worst of the two." What chromatic does is apply an extremely subtle, old-school retro effect that you could easily say fails at imitating cameras from the 90s. It sounds cool on paper when you use the word retro, but the reality is it just adds red and blue lines to things to the point where you're kind of questioning if your screen has an issue or if you should get your eyes checked. Film grain does exactly what it says. It adds a grainy look to your screen and arguably makes it worse. Maybe that's just my preference, but both of these settings slow your performance down and should be turned off. A buddy of mine was asking why his recordings were looking so strange, and this is the screenshot that he sent me. 2 things came to my mind: brightness and HDR. I'll explain the second one in a moment, but yeah, he was at a brightness level of 1 and had been playing like this for years. Because of some funky monitor settings, it wasn't looking that dark to him, but once he looked at an actual raw recording, he realized just how dark it was. I personally run 6 because of the darker maps in Destiny, but 5 is a great option too. The second one I mentioned was HDR, which stands for the high dynamic range of how dark or bright your image is going to be. It's not a computer only thing, it can be on TVs as well, but the point is that ever since the release of Witch Queen, it got super messed up, and now it'll randomly turn on or off when it shouldn't, which can cause some pretty crazy results. Basically, if you're ever confused about why your game suddenly looks wild, check and see if you have this, then go with the opposite. Moving on in the list is sensitivity, where we've got some new settings in the game and a refresher to double check what you have. Starting out is just a reminder that your look sensitivity is your base, just looking around in the game without aiming down sights. The ADS modifier takes care of the latter, and early on in Destiny, controller players didn't have this option, and I think it plays a role in why I still see people mixing up how these two things work together, even if you're using a mouse. First of all, let's just pretend I had a look sensitivity of 10 with a 0.7 ADS. That modifier will slow things down when I'm aiming down sights, but it does not mean it's going to feel like 7 sensitivity. I recommend starting at 1.0 and then working your way down until you feel comfortable. A good range for your look sense is between 5 and 15. I would say 8 is fairly optimal, and then honestly, anything between 0.5 and 1.0 is fine for ADS. On M&K, however, you have to be careful comparing with others because it completely depends on your mouse DPI. That is a setting that every mouse has, which is basically how fast it'll move around on your desktop. The actual in-game speed of your aim in Destiny will be that desktop speed adjusted by the look sensitivity setting in-game. I, for example, run 800 DPI on my mouse with a 5 look sensitivity in-game. So for me, it works out to a 4000 true sensitivity. 800 DPI times 5 in-game sense. There's technically more happening behind the scenes, but basically if your aim is shaky, spend some time on Google figuring out your mouse's DPI and then multiply it by your look sense in-game to determine what you're actually running. Because I've seen people with as high as 100,000 true sense without even knowing, and it's no wonder they struggle to hit their shots. That's literally 25 times faster than mine. As for the ADS modifier, since there's no acceleration at play here like controller, I recommend between 0.7 and 1.0 with my personal preference at 0.9. On the topic of mouse and keyboard, please turn off aim smoothing. It actually adds acceleration to your aim and is a bad idea if you're trying to develop muscle memory since it no longer becomes one-to-one. A good example of this, and a myth that I want to bust, is a Windows setting called Enhanced Pointer Precision. Having that on is useful for general desktop tasks like nailing that X on a folder to close it every time instead of overshooting it. That's because it'll decelerate your mouse as you're trying to go for that little corner button. But in gaming, you don't want accelerations in the mix at all, which is why you need to turn aim smoothing off. The myth, however, is that I once believed that you needed to stress about making sure this checkbox was off when gaming with Destiny, but I was actually wrong. It uses your mouse's raw input, so you don't need to stress about this if you had this checkbox on. Now, speaking of aim, I think it's a good time to mention the brand new controller settings that can make you aim better, like Deadzones. And honestly, even if you're on M&K, you might find this pretty interesting or helpful to a friend that uses a controller. If not though, of course, feel free to skip to the next timestamp on the list. For Deadzones, we're going to focus in on the thumbstick. I can move this thing around however I want, but it's limited to within a circle of movement. I'm going to take that circle and expand it a bit, then add a dot to represent its input. If I move my thumbstick to the left, a dot moves to the left. Add the game in behind and it looks like it all lines up. Push left on my controller, the input goes left and so does the game. Except that's not actually what's happening. I had to manipulate this footage for demonstration. What's really happening is my thumbstick moves to the left, the input is registering it, but then nothing happens in game. This is real-time footage now and what is called a dead zone. It's an area where nothing happens on screen despite me clearly moving my thumbstick, registering an input, and Bungie does this on purpose, by the way, all because of something called stick drift. Many controllers out there, especially older or overused ones, send a small amount of input to the game even when they're not touching the thumbstick at all. This is stick drift, where the cursor is randomly moving or even your aim in game. And to combat that, Bungie puts like a restricted zone, essentially telling the game, don't move the aimer unless the thumbstick goes beyond that zone. It solves millions of controller issues and in general is necessary, but the problem is it also creates a feeling of input delay. The example I'm showing you is a radial dead zone, and now you can control the size of that restricted zone instead of being locked into the 0.13 default number that Bungie came up with as a blanket one-size-fits-all solution. In other words, it's how much you need to move your thumbstick before you see something happen. But like I said, millions of controllers have imperfections out there, and I don't recommend running 0. Basically, you want to start at 0 and see if you have stick drift first, then slowly move this number up until you don't see any movement at all. The axial dead zone is the same concept, but instead of a circle, it's represented by a cross. Generally, when people want to move their thumbstick up or down, maybe left or right, that's just it. They want to go in those directions exactly. So Bungie adds an axial dead zone where any tiny movements veering off of that intended direction aren't registered. For example, if I hold my thumbstick up or down to move my cursor in those directions, I can actually wiggle it to the left and right without the cursor budging at all. Same thing goes for your aimer in game. This sounds crazy when it comes to developing muscle memory with aim, but it's actually a lot more handy than people think, and more so a gut feel compared to the radial issue. You might want to keep it at the 0.12 default, but honestly, anything between 0.06 and there is a really good start if you want to tinker with it. Hopefully that clears up how those things work. I didn't want to draw this on too long because there's a lot more to cover, but a couple more final things on this page are like controller vibration. You should definitely turn this off, at least for PvP. The shake will mess with your aim, or at least take your attention away from what you should actually be focusing on. Sprint turn is exactly what it says. It's how fast you can turn while sprinting. It goes from 0.3 to 0.8, and the one thing I'll mention is that it's relative to your overall look sensitivity. So if you were to bump up your sense a ton, just remember to adjust this as well. Lastly is the double press delay. It lets you choose between 1 and 5 with a bunch of millisecond information. This is how long you have for a double tap to properly register. For example, say you double tap to dodge on Hunter. If you were on a setting of 5, that means that you could press the first button, and then as long as you pressed it a second time within 392 milliseconds, it'll still activate your dodge. If you were to lower it to 1, that means you'd have to press that second button within 233 milliseconds. With a shorter time frame, you can do things like crouch shooting in a fight as a hunter without dodging by accident, but this setting is also largely dependent on how you feel. Moving on to the next section, we have some critical button binds covering options on both inputs. The first one is the concept of toggle versus hold relating to sprint and crouch. Sprint for controller or toggle sprint for keyboard, not hold. If this is not the case, it's gonna feel weird tapping it at first and thinking you have to cancel, but trust me, it's 100 times better for your gameplay because pretty well anything auto cancels it anyway. The second and more important one is crouch. Opposite to sprint, you want this one to be on hold. Not just for crouch spamming, I know that can look hilarious, but more so for slides. When you see good players constantly sliding, it's because they can quickly hit their toggle sprint button followed by tapping the hold crouch button and keep on going over and over. The next one is your interact button. Try to make sure that this is on something that allows you to still aim while holding it, and ideally even strafe. On M&K, some great options are caps lock or alt, but I know on controller it's harder without a paddle, which I've always used. Something more so for controller is swapping to heavy. Holding down Y or triangle is fine for your main one, but I recommend adding a D-pad button, either up or down depending on your platform, so you can have a single tap alternative. It makes DPS rotations way quicker and even comes in handy in PvP sometimes. Two more quick ones for controller are about the finisher and Sparrow dismount. Try out double tapping reload for your finisher because it doesn't get in the way of anything else and it lets you spam it. And for dismounting your Sparrow, I recommend changing it to your jump button. You will save yourself many times, I promise. For the keyboards out there, try out your mouse wheel for an alternate jump button. It can help you tighten skate, launch off of staircases and ramps with a warlock, and even give a nice little medium jump height for hunters. The last button recommendation before getting to the final video settings comes with something that sounds intense, but I promise it's not, and it applies to the next section as well. I personally wanted my E button to work for both the shatter dive and dodge on Hunter, but it wouldn't let me. That was until I found a fix. A lot of your PC game settings are saved in a specific folder on your computer. Close your game and follow the file path on screen to get to that folder where you'll see two files. I promise you nothing's at risk here and you're not messing anything up with this. If you're extra concerned, you can make copies of these files to some other location on your computer as a backup, but then what you want to do is right-click the cvars.xml file and hit Edit in Notepad. Again, this looks intense, but it's super easy. I can scroll down and set both my class ability and air move to E. I literally just type it in, hit save, close out the file, and boot up the game again. Just like that, I get to have my keybind preference. Now moving on to the advanced video settings, there's going to be some for console and some for PC. Regarding the performance of your machine, obviously running everything on low will make the game run as smooth as possible, but there's a few that are worth keeping on with no impact, and even some things that you can make better using that CVARs file we just talked about. The first of the bunch is field of view, otherwise known as FOV. I know this slider isn't available on old gen consoles, but it is on all of the new ones and all computers, so it's worth talking about because it ranges from 55 to 105. The lower the number, the more zoomed in you feel. Targets appear larger at the cost of not being able to see as much. I personally advocate for 105 FOV because to me, that screen real estate around you is critical in a panic. One example is when you're aiming down sights, you have no radar, right? So if someone is flanking me while I'm unscoping from my weapon, I need to be able to react as soon as possible. The second is how important it is for shotgunning. Oftentimes you're in a chaotic moment, and the best thing you can do is, instead of scrambling your aim around to look for them, just letting them fall into your sights thanks to your peripheral vision is the best way to hit your shot. This is only possible when you have your FOV set high enough. If you're on PC, I always tell people to stick to full screen mode. The other options can be rough for latency, and if you have Alt-Tab issues when you're on full screen mode, try Alt-Enter. Doing that back and forth can make things manageable as well. Then we have VSync. Turn this off. The reason it's there in the first place is to help fix something called screen tearing. This is what happens when your game's FPS is way too high for your monitor's refresh rate. Basically, your GPU is sending so many frame updates to the monitor that it can't keep up and accidentally splices two of the wrong ones together. VSync tries to combat this by slowing down your GPU's image updates to match your monitor's refresh rate. And it sounds great in theory, but results in bad input latency that you do not want. G-Sync is fairly common nowadays and better. You can try capping your frame rate, or I should mention that they now have the Reflex option at the bottom if you have an NVIDIA graphics card. This was bugged at release a long time ago, but if you're coming back, Bungie has fixed it and it's amazing. Turn that on if you can. Another crucial one to talk about is depth of field. It makes it so that when you aim down sights, things in your surroundings become blurred. This is not to be confused with motion blur, because this is even when you're standing still. The concept is great from an aesthetics perspective in cinema, but for gaming, not only does it make it way harder to see what you need to during an engagement, it also tanks your game's performance. Make sure you've got that off. Now, with those common ones out of the way, there's still a few more definitely worth you checking out, but in case people don't like to run bare minimum on everything, for example, I've actually split it out into ones that have huge impacts on your performance and ones that have a lesser impact on the frame rate. Starting with the big ticket items, you've got ambient occlusion, and this is what makes things feel real by adding indirect shadows. In this picture, for example, you can see at the bottom how it adds some darkness and contrast to the steel's shine, right? And honestly, it does look way better. It comes at a pretty big performance cost, so I turn mine off, but if you insist on having it, at least don't use 3D. HDAO is a lot more efficient and still kind of gives you a good balance. The next two, shadows and foliage, go hand in hand. When you look in game, you'll see shadow quality, foliage shadows distance, and foliage detail. You want to set these at their minimums, but you can actually go one step further and hop back into that CVARs file that I showed you earlier. Again, totally safe to do this and won't break your game. Just close Destiny, right-click the XML, and edit in Notepad. Find those three keywords and change them to 0, but then there's a fourth setting called local light shadows. Changing that to 0 in combination with the other three will give you the best performance boost you can find, but of course it's up to you on what you want visually. With those knocked out, we have 3 more video settings worth your time before we close out with the final section. Environmental detail distance does just that. Determines how much detail there is on objects far away in the distance. Sometimes it'll completely remove them if it's really unimportant, like the number of trees at the back here. It's not the end of the world if you can't see that there's 70 versus 50 trees. I always run that at minimum. Character detail distance is the same thing, but I run it on high, which is primarily for PvP reasons. I want Guardians to have as much detail as possible regardless of how close or far they are, and this one doesn't hit your FPS much in Crucible. For PvE though, it can hurt when there's a ton of enemies, so you may want to prioritize environment detail over it. Lastly, you have wind impulse. This makes it so that the environment reacts to things that you do, like if I slam down here on the grass, you'll see them kind of wave around. I turn it off because it doesn't even look good at what it's trying to do. Moving on, we have the last category, which arguably could be called miscellaneous. I just don't know what to call it. There's one for PC, one for everyone, and one for console. For everyone playing on Steam, you can access DIM right from inside your game with one hotkey. To set it up, hit Shift plus Tab and open their menu where you can access the web browser at the bottom. This is basically just the internet, but the trick is setting DIM as your homepage so that every time you're in game and hit Shift Tab, it will automatically bring up the browser with DIM loaded. You can do this in the Steam settings under the in-game section. Just copy paste your specific DIM URL into that bar and save it. I never did talk about sound in this video, and although it's a simple one, it's important. For PvP, if you're serious about playing the best you can, I highly recommend turning down or off the dialogue and music because they will easily distract you from hitting any of the shots that you need to. Now let's bust a few myths about crossplay. This setting does not determine whether or not you play with PC players. It's actually just the cross-console button with a bit of nuance behind it that I found pretty interesting, like how Xbox doesn't even have this option in their game. I went down a bit of a rabbit hole and ended up making this drawing. On the left is PvE with 3 pools of players, technically. There's the main one with all platforms together, like PC, Xbox, PlayStation, new gen, old gen, just all of it. Then you have a second one, which is a PlayStation only pool, and that's for folks with their crossplay setting off. Basically means they don't want to play with anyone other than PlayStation only. Then technically there's an Xbox only pool, but it truly doesn't exist. Because they don't have the in-game option to switch on and off, Xbox players have crossplay on by default at all times. That pushes them into that top pool where we all are for PvE. There is a system procedure to manually turn off crossplay for Xbox, but it breaks many aspects of the game's matchmaking and just not worth it. On the PvP side, you technically have 4 pools. The first is called the PC pool. This is made up of fire teams that are all PC players, of course, but also if you're on console and have anyone from PC on your fire team before loading into a match, you're going to be playing in that PC pool. It doesn't matter what you have for that crossplay button. The second pool is called the console pool. This is what the crossplay button is for, so it's going to have the PlayStation players with crossplay on, and then all of the other Xbox players because again, they have no option to turn off. Essentially, if you're on console and not paired up with anyone with PC, this is where you're going to be by default. And then lastly, just like PvE, there's a PlayStation pool for folks that turn that setting off in-game, and then the Xbox pool is, again, kind of just non-existent. Main takeaway here is that having crossplay on does not mean you're going to be pooled with PC players. All it means is that you'll be cross-console, and the only way to be in the PC pool is if you have a PC player in your pre-made fire team. Alright, I dove pretty deep on this one and worked really hard to give you the best information I could, so if you found any of it helpful, consider leaving a like, or if you're feeling extra generous, maybe even the super thanks button. I appreciate you watching and have a good one.